Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, unveiling their significance. Welcome, dear friends, to my channel Gaming Sim Life. Today we will do in-depth exploration of one of the most enigmatic and powerful symbols in biblical literature, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. I'm your host, Dev, and in this episode, we'll be diving deep into the pages of the book of Revelation to uncover the mysteries, meanings, and enduring significance of these iconic figures. The Four Horsemen have captivated the imagination of believers, scholars, and artists for nearly 2 millennia. They've been depicted in countless paintings, referenced in literature and film, and have become a shorthand for the very concept of apocalypse itself. But who are these riders? What do they represent? And what can they tell us about the unfolding of the end times as described in the Bible? To answer these questions, we need to start at the beginning with the book of Revelation itself. This final book of the New Testament stands apart from the rest of Scripture in both its style and content. It's a work of apocalyptic literature, a genre that was popular in Jewish and early Christian circles during the 1st century CE. The word apocalypse comes from the Greek apocalypsis, meaning unveiling or revelation, and that's exactly what this book claims to be: a divine revelation of future events given to a man named John on the island of Patmos. The book of Revelation is a complex tapestry of visions, symbols, and prophecies. It speaks of cosmic battles, divine judgments, and the ultimate triumph of good over evil. And right at the heart of this narrative, we find our four horsemen, emerging as the first 4 of 7 seals are broken open. In today's episode, we'll be exploring the historical and cultural context in which Revelation was written, the specific passages that introduce the Four Horsemen, a detailed look at each of the first 2 horsemen, their descriptions, interpretations, and significance. And we'll begin to unpack the complex symbolism and theology behind these figures. So saddle up, friends. We're about to embark on a journey through time, scripture, and the human imagination as we unveil the significance of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Historical and cultural context. Before we dive into the text of Revelation itself, it's crucial that we understand the context in which it was written. This background will help us better interpret the symbolism and messages contained within the book, including those related to the Four Horsemen. The book of Revelation is attributed to a man named John, who identifies himself as a servant of Jesus Christ. Traditionally, this John was believed to be the same John who wrote the Gospel of John and the epistles of 1, 2, and 3 John. However, modern scholars are divided on this issue, with many believing that Revelation was written by a different John, often referred to as John of Patmos. Patmos is a small Greek island in the Aegean Sea. According to the opening of Revelation, John was on this island because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus, Revelation 1 verse 9. This phrase likely indicates that John was in exile on Patmos, possibly as a result of persecution for his Christian faith. The exact date of Revelation's writing is debated, but most scholars place it towards the end of the 1st century CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Domitian, around 95 CE. This was a time of increasing tension between the early Christian Church and the Roman Empire. To understand the world in which Revelation was written, we need to picture the Roman Empire at the height of its power. It stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Middle East. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, had brought relative stability to much of the known world. But for many early Christians, this was not a time of peace at all. The Roman Empire demanded allegiance from its subjects, and this often took the form of emperor worship. Christians, with their monotheistic beliefs and refusal to acknowledge the emperor as divine, found themselves increasingly at odds with the imperial cult. Persecution of Christians was sporadic but could be intense, especially under emperors like Nero and Domitian. It's in this context of political oppression and religious persecution that we should understand the apocalyptic visions of Revelation. The book is not just a prediction of future events, but a powerful message of hope and resistance for a community under threat. Now, let's talk about the genre of apocalyptic literature. This was a popular form of writing in Jewish and early Christian circles during this period. Apocalyptic literature is characterized by 1. Visions or dreams that reveal hidden truths about the spiritual realm and the future. 2. Heavy use of symbolism and imagery. 3. A cosmic struggle between good and evil. 4. Divine judgment and the ultimate triumph of God's kingdom. Other examples of apocalyptic literature include parts of the biblical book of Daniel and non-canonical works like the Book of Enoch. These writings often emerged during times of crisis or oppression, offering hope to the faithful by assuring them that God was in control and would ultimately set things right. The Book of Revelation fits squarely within this tradition, but it's unique in its Christian perspective and its place as the capstone of the New Testament canon. Its vivid imagery, including the Four Horsemen, would have resonated with readers familiar with both Jewish apocalyptic traditions and the realities of life under Roman rule. Understanding this context is crucial as we turn to the text itself. The Four Horsemen, like much of Revelation, speak to both the immediate concerns of John's audience and to broader, timeless themes of judgment, suffering, and divine sovereignty. Keep this in mind as we now turn to the specific passages that introduce these enigmatic figures. The Four Horsemen in Scripture. Now that we've set the stage, let's turn to the biblical text itself. The Four Horsemen appear in the 6th chapter of Revelation as part of a larger sequence involving the opening of 7 seals. The scene is set in heaven, where John sees a scroll in the right hand of God, sealed with 7 seals. No one in heaven or on earth is found worthy to open the scroll, causing John to weep. But then the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, identified as the Lamb who was slain, appears and is deemed worthy to open the seals. As each of the first 4 seals is broken, a horseman appears. Let's read the relevant passages. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Revelation 6 verses 1 to 2. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come!" Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. Revelation 6 verses 3 to 4. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Revelation 6 verses 5 to 6. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Revelation 6 verses 7 to 8. These passages are rich with symbolism and meaning. Each horse has a distinct color, and each rider carries specific objects or is given particular powers. The sequence of their appearance and the progressively worsening effects they bring suggest an unfolding narrative of judgment or calamity. It's important to note that while these figures have become known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, this exact phrase doesn't appear in the Bible. The term apocalypse here refers to the Greek title of the book of Revelation, which is Apocalypsis Ioannou, or Revelation of John. As we delve into each horseman individually, we'll explore the various interpretations that have been proposed for these figures over the centuries. But before we do that, it's worth considering why John might have used the image of horsemen in the first place. In the ancient world, horses were symbols of power, speed, and conquest. They were essential to warfare and played a crucial role in the expansion of empires. By depicting these harbingers of judgment as mounted on horses, John emphasizes their swift and unstoppable nature. Moreover, the number 4 in biblical symbolism often represents completeness or universality, as in the 4 corners of the earth or the 4 winds. The 4 horsemen, then, might be seen as representing a complete or universal judgment that affects all of creation. With this overview in mind, let's turn our attention to the first of these enigmatic figures, the rider on the white horse. The first horseman, the white horse. The first seal is broken, and a voice like thunder calls forth the initial horseman. John describes the scene. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Revelation 6 verse 2. This description, though brief, is packed with symbolic elements that have led to a variety of interpretations over the centuries. Let's break it down. 1. The white horse. In many cultures, white is associated with purity, righteousness, and victory. In the context of Revelation, it's worth noting that Christ himself is later depicted riding a white horse in chapter 19. 2. The bow. This weapon suggests warfare, but interestingly, no arrows are mentioned. Some interpreters see this as indicating bloodless conquest. 3. The crown. The Greek word used here is Stephanos, which typically refers to a victor's crown, not a royal crown. 4. The conqueror. The rider is described as one who conquers and is bent on conquest. These elements have led to three main interpretations of the first horseman. 1. Conquest or military victory. Some see this rider as a representation of conquest in general, or specific conquerors like the Parthians, who were known for their skilled mounted archers and posed a threat to Rome. 2. Christ or the gospel. Others interpret this rider positively, seeing parallels with Christ's description in Revelation 19. In this view, the white horse represents purity, the bow bloodless conquest, and the crown victory. The conquest, then, would be the spread of the gospel. 3. The Antichrist or false Christ. A third interpretation sees this rider as a force of evil masquerading as good. This view often connects the first horseman with the beast described later in Revelation, who also wears crowns and conquers. Each of these interpretations has its strengths and challenges. The conquest interpretation fits well with the following horsemen, who bring war, famine, and death, typical consequences of conquest. The Christ interpretation aligns with the color symbolism and the later depiction of Christ. The Antichrist interpretation resonates with warnings elsewhere in the New Testament about false Christs and the deceptive nature of evil. It's worth noting that these interpretations aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. Apocalyptic literature often employs multi-layered symbolism, and the first horseman could represent different things in different contexts or on different levels of interpretation. What's clear, regardless of the specific interpretation, is that this first horseman represents a powerful force unleashed upon the world. Whether it's military conquest, spiritual victory, or deceptive evil, it sets in motion a chain of events that will be followed by war, famine, and death. As we move on to discuss the second horseman, keep in mind how these figures interact and build upon each other. The four horsemen aren't isolated symbols, but part of a larger narrative of judgment and tribulation. Their sequence and cumulative effect are just as important as their individual meanings. The second horseman, the red horse. As the Lamb opens the second seal, another dramatic figure emerges. John describes it thus: "Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword." Revelation 6 verse 4. This description leaves little room for ambiguity. The second horseman is almost universally interpreted as a representation of war. Let's examine the symbolic elements. 1. The red horse. The color red is vividly described as fiery or flame-colored in the original Greek. This immediately evokes images of blood and fire, both closely associated with warfare. 2. Taking peace from the earth. This phrase directly indicates the horseman's role in bringing conflict and strife to the world. 3. Making people kill each other. This goes beyond organized warfare to suggest widespread violence and civil strife. 4. The large sword. Unlike the bow of the first horseman, which could be interpreted in various ways, the sword is an unambiguous symbol of violence and bloodshed. The second horseman's appearance marks a stark shift from the ambiguous nature of the first. Here, we see a clear and terrifying picture of a world plunged into violence and chaos. This horseman doesn't just bring war in the sense of nations fighting nations, but a complete breakdown of peace at all levels of society. Historically, this image would have resonated powerfully with John's audience. The Roman Empire, for all its claims of bringing peace, was built on military conquest and maintained through force. Jewish readers would have been painfully aware of the devastating Jewish-Roman War of 66 to 73 CE, which resulted in the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem. Early Christians were experiencing increasing persecution, but the second horseman's relevance extends far beyond the first century. Throughout human history, war has been a constant companion, bringing devastation, suffering, and death. In the 20th century alone, 2 world wars and countless other conflicts claimed millions of lives and reshaped the global landscape. In a theological sense, the second horseman can be seen as a judgment on humanity's propensity for violence and our failure to live in peace with one another. It strips away the veneer of civilization and exposes the brutal reality of human conflict. Some interpreters have tried to link the second horseman to specific wars or periods of conflict. However, it's perhaps more useful to see this figure as representing the universal and timeless reality of human warfare and violence. It's worth noting the progression from the first horseman to the second. If we interpret the first as conquest, then war follows as a natural consequence. If we see the first as Christ or the spread of the gospel, then the second could represent the persecution and conflict that often follow in the wake of Christian expansion. And if we understand the first as the Antichrist, then the second shows the violence that false messiahs and misguided ideologies can unleash. The second horseman challenges us to reflect on the nature of peace and conflict in our world. It raises uncomfortable questions about human nature, the cycles of violence that plague our societies, and our responsibility in promoting peace. As we'll see with the subsequent horsemen, the consequences of war extend far beyond the battlefield, setting the stage for further suffering and death. The third horseman, the black horse. As we continue our journey through the apocalyptic vision of John, we come to the third seal and the emergence of the third horseman. Let's revisit the text. When the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures, saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Revelation 6 verses 5 to 6. This passage introduces us to one of the most intriguing and complex of the 4 horsemen. Let's break down the symbolism. 1. The black horse. The color black often symbolizes death, mourning, and scarcity in biblical literature. 2. The scales. This is a tool for measuring, specifically for weighing out small amounts of food or other commodities. 3. The prices. The voice announces prices for wheat and barley that are exorbitantly high by ancient standards. 4. The protection of oil and wine. Curiously, these luxury items are specifically protected. The third horseman is widely interpreted as a representation of famine. The black color suggests the despair and death that accompany severe food shortages. The scales indicate the careful measuring out of scarce resources. The prices mentioned, about 10 times the normal rate for grain in ancient times, point to severe scarcity and inflation. However, the protection of oil and wine adds a layer of complexity to this interpretation. Some scholars see this as an indication of economic inequality, where basic necessities become unaffordable for most, while luxury goods remain available to the wealthy. Others interpret it as a sign of God's mercy, ensuring that not everything is destroyed. The third horseman follows logically from the first 2. Whether we see the sequence as conquest, war, and now famine, or as a progression of judgments, the connection is clear. War often leads to food shortages as agriculture is disrupted, trade routes are severed, and resources are diverted to military efforts. Historically, famine has been one of humanity's most persistent and devastating enemies. From ancient times to the present day, food shortages have caused immense suffering and reshaped societies. In John's time, the Roman Empire's ability to provide a stable food supply was one of its key selling points. making the threat of famine particularly terrifying. In a broader sense, the third horseman can be seen as a judgment on economic systems that prioritize profit over human need. The image of carefully measured out grain at inflated prices, while luxury goods are protected, resonates with many modern economic critiques. Theologically, this horseman challenges us to consider our relationship with material resources. It raises questions about stewardship, justice, and our responsibility to ensure that all have access to basic necessities. In a world where millions still suffer from malnutrition and food insecurity, the ride of the black horse continues. As we move on to the fourth and final horseman, we'll see how these calamities, conquest, war, and famine culminate in the most feared rider of all, the fourth horseman, the pale horse. We now come to the breaking of the fourth seal and the appearance of the final, and perhaps most chilling, of the four horsemen. John describes the scene. When the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, "Come!" I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. Revelation 6 verses 7 to 8. This passage presents us with a powerful and terrifying image. Let's examine its components. 1. The pale horse. The Greek word used here, chloros, can mean pale green or ashen. It's the color of a corpse, fittingly carrying death as its rider. 2. Death as the rider. Unlike the previous horseman, this one is explicitly named. 3. Hades following. In Greek mythology, Hades is the realm of the dead. Here, it personifies the grave, following to claim death's victims. 4. Power over a fourth of the earth. This indicates the extensive, but not total, reach of this horseman's influence. 5. Multiple means of death. Sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts encompass a wide range of mortal threats. The fourth horseman represents death in its most comprehensive form. While the previous horseman brought conditions that could lead to death, war, and famine, this rider is death itself, accompanied by the grave. The pale or ashen color of the horse vividly evokes the pallor of a corpse, creating a haunting image of death personified. It's significant that this horseman uses multiple means to claim lives. The sword recalls the second horseman, war, while famine echoes the third. Plague adds disease to the mix, and wild beasts suggest a breakdown of the natural order where animals no longer fear humans. This comprehensive assault on human life paints a picture of a world in chaos, where death comes from all quarters. The limitation of the fourth horseman's power to a fourth of the earth is intriguing. It suggests that, as terrible as this judgment is, it is still limited. God's sovereignty remains intact, and this is not yet the end of all things. Historically, the image of death riding forth would have resonated powerfully with John's audience. In a world without modern medicine, where plagues could depopulate entire regions and wild animals posed a real threat, death was a much more visible and immediate presence than it is for many of us today. Theologically, the fourth horseman represents the ultimate consequence of sin and judgment. In the biblical narrative, death entered the world as a result of human disobedience. Here, we see it unleashed as an agent of divine judgment. Yet even in this grim image, we can find a glimmer of hope. The power of death, though great, is limited. And in the larger context of Revelation, we know that death itself will ultimately be defeated. The fourth horseman is a fearsome enemy, but not the final word. As we conclude our examination of the individual horsemen, we're left with a sobering picture of judgment and calamity. But to fully understand their significance, we need to step back and look at them as a whole. How do these four figures work together? What is the overall message they convey? That's what we'll explore next. Comparative analysis of the four horsemen. Now that we've examined each of the four horsemen individually, let's take a step back and look at them as a collective unit. How do these figures relate to each other? What overall message do they convey? First, let's consider the progression of the horsemen. 1. The white horse, Conquest, or possibly Antichrist. 2. The red horse, War. 3. The black horse, Famine. 4. The pale horse, death. There's a clear escalation in the severity and finality of each horseman's impact. We move from conquest, which doesn't necessarily involve widespread death, to open warfare, to famine, and finally to death itself. This progression suggests a domino effect of calamities, each building upon the last. If we interpret the first horseman as conquest, we can see a logical sequence of events. Conquest leads to war, war disrupts agriculture and trade, leading to famine, and all of these culminate in death. This pattern has played out countless times throughout human history. Alternatively, if we see the first horseman as representing Christ or the spread of the gospel, we might interpret the sequence differently. The proclamation of the gospel is followed by persecution, war, hardship, famine, and martyrdom, death. This aligns with Jesus' warnings to his disciples about the cost of following him. The colors of the horses also tell a story. We move from white, victory or deception, to red, bloodshed, to black, mourning and scarcity, to pale green, death. It's a visual representation of descending from the height of conquest to the depths of the grave. Another point of comparison is the specificity of the horsemen's descriptions. The first is the most ambiguous, leading to multiple interpretations. The second and third are more specific in their imagery and effects. The fourth is the most explicit, named outright as death. This increasing clarity might be seen as a way of emphasizing the seriousness and inevitability of these judgments. It's also worth noting the cosmic scale of the horsemen's activities. They are released by the breaking of seals in heaven, called forth by celestial beings, and given authority over large swaths of the earth. This emphasizes that these are not merely human events, but part of a divine plan unfolding on a universal scale. At the same time, the horsemen interact with very earthly human realities: war, economic hardship, disease. This interplay between the cosmic and the mundane is a key feature of apocalyptic literature, suggesting that everyday events have spiritual significance. Collectively, the four horsemen present a sobering picture of human history and divine judgment. They suggest that calamities which we might see as separate: war, economic crisis, pandemic, are in fact interconnected and part of a larger spiritual narrative. Yet, it's crucial to remember that in the context of Revelation, the four horsemen are not the end of the story. They are part of a larger sequence of events leading to ultimate redemption. Their ride is terrible but temporary. As we conclude this comparative analysis, we're left with some profound questions. How should we understand suffering and calamity in light of this vision? What responsibility do we have to combat the evils represented by the horsemen? And how can we maintain hope in the face of such daunting forces? These are questions that theologians, scholars, and believers have wrestled with for centuries. And that brings us to our next topic: how the four horsemen have been interpreted throughout history. Interpretations across history. The four horsemen of the apocalypse have captured the imagination of readers for nearly 2 millennia. Over this time, interpretations of these figures have evolved, reflecting the changing contexts and concerns of each era. Let's take a journey through history to explore how understanding of the horsemen has developed. Early Christian interpretations, 2nd to 5th centuries. In the centuries immediately following the writing of Revelation, early Christian writers like Irenaeus, Victorinus, and Augustine offered their interpretations of the four horsemen. Many saw the horsemen as representing events that would precede the return of Christ. Victorinus, writing in the 3rd century, interpreted the white horse as the word of preaching, the red horse as war, the black horse as famine, and the pale horse as pestilence. Others, like Augustine, tended to interpret Revelation more allegorically. In his view, the horsemen represented ongoing realities in the life of the church, rather than specific future events. Medieval and Renaissance perspectives, 6th to 16th centuries. During the Middle Ages, interpretation of Revelation, including the four horsemen, was heavily influenced by the allegorical approach. Theologians like Bede and Joachim of Fiore saw the horsemen as representing various aspects of the church's history and spiritual warfare. The horsemen also became a popular subject in medieval art. Illuminated manuscripts often depicted them, contributing to the iconic imagery we associate with them today. During the Renaissance and Reformation periods, there was renewed interest in more literal interpretations of Revelation. Some Protestant reformers saw the horsemen as representing God's judgments on a corrupt church. Modern and contemporary views, 17th century present. The Enlightenment brought new approaches to biblical interpretation, including historical critical methods. Scholars began to examine Revelation in light of its historical context, seeing the horsemen as reflecting the realities of the Roman Empire. In the 19th and 20th centuries, dispensationalist interpretations gained popularity, especially in America. These views often saw the horsemen as literal future events preceding Christ's return. More recently, scholars have emphasized the symbolic and literary nature of Revelation. Many now interpret the horsemen as representing timeless realities of human existence, the ongoing cycles of conquest, war, economic hardship, and death. Throughout history, people have also applied the imagery of the Four Horsemen to current events. During World War I, for instance, some saw the conflict as fulfilling the prophecy of the horsemen. Similar applications have been made to subsequent wars, economic crises, and pandemics. Today, interpretations of the Four Horsemen vary widely. 1. Futurist interpretations see them as predictions of end-time events yet to come. 2. Historicist views attempt to match the horsemen with specific historical events or eras. 3. Preterist interpretations understand them as referring primarily to events in the first century. 4. Idealist or symbolic approaches see the horsemen as representing ongoing realities throughout history. What's clear from this historical survey is that the Four Horsemen have proven to be enduring and adaptable symbols. They've spoken to the fears, hopes, and experiences of people across vastly different times and cultures. This adaptability is part of what makes the Four Horsemen so powerful as apocalyptic symbols. They're specific enough to create vivid imagery, yet open to interpretation in ways that allow them to remain relevant across changing contexts. As we continue to face global challenges like warfare, economic inequality, and pandemic disease, the Four Horsemen remain a potent metaphor for the fragility of human civilization and the ever-present possibility of catastrophe. Yet, as we've seen, the message of the horsemen is not ultimately one of despair. In the larger context of Revelation, they're part of a narrative that moves towards hope and redemption. Perhaps this is why they continue to fascinate us. They speak to our deepest fears, but also point beyond them to the possibility of ultimate justice and peace. As we conclude our exploration of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, we're left with a profound appreciation for the enduring power of this ancient symbolism. These writers, conquest, war, famine, and death, have captivated imaginations and challenged interpretations for nearly 2 millennia. They speak to the timeless human experiences of conflict, scarcity, and mortality, while also pointing to deeper spiritual realities. Whether viewed as literal prophecy, allegorical teaching, or literary metaphor, the Four Horsemen continue to resonate in our modern world, reminding us of the fragility of peace and prosperity. Yet, within the larger context of Revelation, they also offer a paradoxical hope, a promise that even in the face of calamity and judgment, a greater purpose unfolds. As we face our own global challenges, the image of these writers urges us to reflect on our place in history, our responsibility to combat suffering, and our capacity for resilience in the face of adversity. The Four Horsemen ride on, not just through the pages of Scripture, but through the corridors of human consciousness, challenging us to contemplate our deepest fears and our highest aspirations.
right, and then exit right. Exit right. Get ready to turn left. Turn left. Keep right. At the roundabout, take the second exit. Exit now. Go straight on. Get ready to turn right. Turn right.